Good afternoon, everyone. We've got a few more people that we're waiting on to who have registered but have not yet joined. So if you just appreciate your patience, we'll just give it another minute or two, and then we'll get started.
I would say go ahead, Philip.
Okay, very good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us on this important webinar today. I'm Philip Wiedmeyer. I am on the board of directors of Transportation Energy Partners, and I'm also chairman and president of the Alabama Clean Fuels Coalition, a Clean Cities Coalition. And today's webinar will include remarks and presentations from myself and also from Ken Brown, who is TEP's Washington-based governmental affairs consultant. So Ken and I will be conducting the webinar today. Just one little housekeeping thing as we go through. If you have a question, please type in the box and send your questions, and we will address them probably not as they come in, but at an appropriate time. So let us start. First, I want to, on behalf of TEP, say thank you to our sponsors. We could not conduct this activity or other activities that TEP undertakes without the support of our sponsors. And please, as you have interface with them, to thank them for their support of TEP. And for those that may not know, TEP is a national nonprofit policy and education organization where we bring together Clean Cities Coalition leaders with leaders from the clean transportation industry. And we try to advance policies that reduce American dependence on petroleum-based fuels. That involves about approximately 100 Clean Cities coalitions and their 15,000 stakeholders in the clean transportation industry across the United States. We try to keep coalitions and stakeholders informed of key policies, programs, and funding opportunities at the federal level. And as we did just recently, we educate decision makers, policymakers, about the importance of advancing the markets for clean vehicles and fuels. Next slide, Ken. We just completed our annual Energy Independence Summit in February, 11th through 13th in Washington. We had about 150 attendees at the summit. We conducted 240 meetings with congressional offices. We had some very good roundtables with industry leaders on what's new developments and outlooks for policy for the upcoming year. And we also had roundtable discussions with some key federal agencies, including DOE, Department of Agriculture, um, um, EPA, and Federal Highway Administration. So thank you if you attended. If not, please mark your calendar for next year. Next year's summit will be at the same time of the year, February, I believe it's 12th through 14th in Washington, and it's the premier event for the clean transportation industry, and really is the key for the successes that we've had. Next slide. And it's really through our collective efforts that we were able to achieve some significant victories during 2018. As you all know, we had some modest increases in the renewable fuel standard volumes through 2019 and also through 2020 for biomass-based diesel. We achieved a funding level and got it done early. Congress passed the appropriations for the DOE, Department of Energy, and the Clean Cities program back in September. So we didn't. That agency did not have to suffer through the shutdown and the delay in appropriating funding for FY2019, and we achieved $37.8 million for the Clean Cities program, and got increased support for the support contracts that coalitions received through the program. We also got an increase in the EPA diesel emissions reduction grant program, the DERA program, from $75 million in FY18 to $87 million for FY2019. And the tax incentives that were that had expired were made retroactive and put back in place and extended through 2017 for alternative fuels, vehicles, and infrastructure. So that's an area where certainly we have more work to do. Next slide. So for this fiscal year, our federal priorities are to, again, increase the funding, maintain and increase the funding for those key alternative fuel programs, primarily the DOE Clean Cities program and EPA's Clean Diesel program, to get the tax incentives that were extended through the get them in place. We'd like to see them in place for a 5-year period so that there is a predictability and stability for fleet decision makers, and we'll be working on that this year. Every year, the renewable fuel standard comes under attack from the petroleum industry, and this year, EPA will be resetting volumes for future years, so it's an important year for that program, and collectively we need to focus attention on that. There's been certainly policy talk in Washington about the possibility of a infrastructure bill moving through Congress this year, and if that does happen, we certainly would want to include alternative fuels and funding for that in any infrastructure bill that hopefully can make it through Congress. And we continue to have a logjam at FHWA on the funding of projects for clean vehicles using the CMAQ program. We've had recent meetings with FHWA about that, and but more work certainly needs to be done to break that logjam and get those funding approved, CMAQ dollars approved for those projects. And now, as we get into more specifics about how we're going to achieve these federal policies, I want to turn it over to Ken Brown, and we're going to be focusing today primarily on two activities related to funding, and that is the funding for the Clean Cities program and hoping to achieve more funding for the competitive grants. DOE has not yet issued, although we hear that it will be soon, the funding opportunity announcement for this year's competitive grants. And we would like to see that program, funding for that program increase. And again, we want to preserve and increase funding for that, for the DERA program and the grants that are used by many in the Clean Cities coalitions and the clean transportation industry. So with that, Ken, will you kind of give us a timeline and what key activities we need to be focused on for this year to be successful?
Yes, thank you, Philip, and hello, everybody. Good to be with you all, as usual. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about the fiscal year 2020 appropriations timeline and process, and how we can all be collectively effective in maximizing funding for both the DOE Clean Cities program and the EPA diesel emission reduction grants. So first of all, it's important to understand the timeline, and even though I think as everybody reads in the newspaper, Washington is a bit dysfunctional, and it's hard to get things done. One thing that has to get done each year by hook or by crook is the appropriations process, which actually funds the federal government. It's bumpy, it's uneven. We don't know exactly how it's going to go from year to year. This year, it the past year, FY2019, it resulted in about 70% of the government being funded actually on time for the first time in years, and at the same time we saw the rest of the government, the remaining 25-30%, which included agencies like the EPA and the Department of Agriculture and many agencies, the government was shut down for 35 days. So you never know what's going to happen, but you do know that there will be action, and we need to be active participants in the action. So what the picture looks like for fiscal year 2020, the administration and president have yet to announce their proposed budget for this fiscal year, and that's one of the first key pieces of business. They typically announce the budget in early February. However, the government was closed at the time, and they were just reopening it, and so they obviously didn't, since they hadn't finished the funding bills for last year, they didn't announce a budget yet for the next year. As of now, the administration is expected to announce their budget in two phases, starting the week of March 11th and then completing it the week of March 18th. So they're not bound to that schedule, but I'm sure it will be about that time. The next important thing to understand is that the way the government is funded is that there are 12 separate appropriation subcommittees in both the House and the Senate. They're the same subcommittees. Each one of those subcommittees writes a bill that funds various agencies. So, for example, the Department of Energy is funded through the Energy and Water Subcommittee, and they prepare what's called the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill. The Environmental Protection Agency is funded through the those subcommittees has a process where every individual member of the House and Senate has the opportunity to submit a letter indicating their funding priorities for the current upcoming fiscal year. And our goal is to get as many House and Senate members as possible to include the DOE Clean Cities program and the EPA diesel emission reduction grants in their requests to the subcommittees. And the more folks that submit those requests, the more support we have for increasing funding for our programs. And those requests will be due. They have not set the deadlines yet for when those requests are due to the subcommittees, but they're likely to be mid to late March for the House, and they're likely to be in April for the Senate. Then the respective appropriation subcommittees will actually write their legislation. The subcommittee action usually happens in the House in April and May, and in the Senate in June. Then the bills go to the House and Senate floor in the summertime, and if things are working smoothly, we see final legislation in the fall, and if not, sometimes it lingers towards the end of the year. One of the things that's going to potentially complicate matters this year is that the House and Senate and the administration do not have an agreement on what the overall budget should be, the overall budget numbers. And so the various subcommittees don't know how much funding they'll have until those agreements are reached. And there was an agreement in place for 2 years for the past 2 fiscal years. That agreement is no longer in place, and so we revert back to some fairly draconian budget caps until a new agreement is reached. So that's one complicating factor that we're going to have to deal with on a macro perspective. In terms of our recommendation for Clean Cities funding, we are requesting $50 million for the Clean Cities program. That's an increase up from the $37.8 million, which is in the current fiscal year. And we're suggesting that increased funding be used for vehicle and infrastructure deployment projects. We're proposing that out of that $50 million, $30 million be used for competitive grants. We're also proposing that to encourage the department to give smaller grants in the range of $500,000 to $1 million per grant. And the purpose of that is so that there can be more grants, more communities and projects, different types of projects can receive grants, more Clean Cities coalitions can participate in grants. And we're also proposing in our language that Clean Cities, at least one Clean Cities coalition should be a participant or partner in every grant. So that's the gist of our recommendation for the coming year. To give you a little background on sort of funding trends, you can see, largely due to our efforts and all of your efforts around the country to weigh in. We've seen an increase in the program funding over the past several years, from $24 million in fiscal year 2015 up to $37.8 million. in fiscal year 2019, the current year. The bottom line is actually for the Clean Cities program, and the way the budget's written, they have it's under a broader category called outreach, deployment, and analysis. So that's what the number on the top line includes, but the number on the bottom line is what actually funds the Clean Cities program. Here's our language. I'm not going to read it to you. We have copies of this on our website and also in the sample letter that we provided to all of you. But you can see it's basically the $50 million for the program, $30 million for competitive deployment grants. Department encouraged to focus on awards that range from $500,000 to $1 million and include at least one Clean Cities coalition as a partner. In terms of the EPA diesel emissions reduction grants program, we're proposing $100 million in fiscal year 2020. You can see here again, we've seen a good positive trend for the DERA program as well, which is good news, and hopefully we can continue that, but substantial increases over the past several years. So now we're going to talk a little bit about our strategy. And before I go to the strategy, let me say one other thing. I want to give a special shout out to a number of Clean Cities Coalition leaders who played a particularly important role. I mean, many of you have been very active and important, but in the appropriations process, the leaders of the appropriation subcommittees are the most important players. They're not the only important players, but they're the most important players. So, for example, in the Senate for the Clean Cities program, Senator Lamar Alexander is the chairman of that subcommittee. He's from Tennessee. And Senator Dianne Feinstein from California is the senior Democrat. So the two of them are really the key players. And Jonathan Overly and his team at the East Tennessee Clean Cities, Clean Fuels Coalition has played a really important role in working with their industry partners to develop a strong relationship with Senator Alexander and his staff. That's been very critical to our success. Likewise, Rick Ruvolo and Richard Battersby in the East Bay Clean Cities Coalition have played an important leadership role in rallying all the California coalitions and many stakeholders in California to help make sure that Senator Feinstein knows how important the program is. On the House side, a shout out to Alicia Culver from the Yellowstone Teton Clean Cities, and also Beth Baird from the what are they called? Not Treasure Island, but Treasure something Clean Cities in Boise, Idaho. But they've worked very closely with Congressman Simpson, and then the Clean Fuels Ohio crowd has been very important in working with Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, who's now the new chairman of the subcommittee. So they're going to play a really important role this year in our efforts to increase the funding. And then on the EPA diesel emission reduction grants, again, folks in Southern California have worked closely with Congressman Ken Calvert. We've had Lisa Thurston and the Twin Cities Coalition in Minnesota working with Congresswoman McCollum. She's now the chairwoman of the House Interior Subcommittee. And on the Senate side, Colin Messer works with Senator Udall. He's been real important. So thank you, Colin, for your great work there. So again, our strategy is to make sure these leaders I just mentioned, these chairmen and women and the ranking members of these subcommittees, hear from their colleagues in Congress that funding for clean cities should be increased, and funding for the DERA grant should be increased. And so what we need to do then is to get all of forms urging your members of the House and Senate to submit formal requests to the key appropriation subcommittees, asking them to include our proposed language and funding. And we've been doing this for several years. That's been the key to our success every year. So we count on you, and we're available to help you follow to undertake this really important task. And then after you've submitted your request to your members of the House and Senate, you need to then follow up with them to make sure that they're actually submitting these requests to the subcommittees. Key deadlines. So some member request deadlines are happening this week. Most of them are not until around the middle of March, and some even a little later. And then again, the House Appropriations subcommittees will have deadlines. These are deadlines for the actual members of the House. Likely, their deadlines are likely to be mid to late March, and the Senate are likely to be early to mid-April. So this process is beginning right now. So what you need to do is, one, determine the deadline for your specific House and Senate offices. You need to send a request letter, or some of them ask you to fill out a form, which includes our requested language, some justification, and our funding levels. We provide, in our most recent email blast, we provided a link to a sample letter that you can send to your members of the House and Senate with the specific language and funding levels we're requesting. And then it's extremely effective if you can get a bunch of your stakeholders to sign on to your letter with you. And then again, we ask you, once you've submitted either your form, and if you have a form, you should list your stakeholders in your form as requesting, as supporting your request to these offices. And then finally, it's very important to follow up to make sure they received your request, and to ask them again to submit the request to the appropriations subcommittees. Again, this is an important year. Every year is important, but this one's particularly important. It's important that we continue our momentum for these programs and the momentum for our industry. The administration, as you know, has not been very supportive of clean energy programs. They've proposed in their first two budgets to eliminate the Clean Cities program, and they've proposed very dramatic cuts for the EPA DERA program. Again, the federal budget caps have not been established for this fiscal year, so that's going to impact the overall spending levels. Hopefully, they'll reach agreement soon on the funding levels. But it's important to remember that despite the lack of support so far, at least from the administration, and that could change, it's ultimately the Congress that's going to decide the funding levels, and we've built very strong bipartisan support in Congress, and we need to continue to reinforce that with your voices from around the country. So it's really critical that members hear from you and all the supporters across the country for these programs and policy. So I think I'm going to stop there before I talk about these other things. I'm going to just check and see if we have any questions. Excuse me. If you have questions, please type them in. I don't see any questions yet. Can't believe nobody's got a question about this process. While you're thinking about your questions, maybe Philip, do you want to add, before we go to these other issues, do you want to add anything about the appropriations process and how to be effective?
Well, sure. Just a few points to follow up on. I'll echo everything that Ken says, how important it is to make contact with your congressional offices and get as many of your stakeholders engaged and signed on to that request as possible. As I've said many times before, all politics is local, and this is local politics in action. And so those members are most interested in satisfying their constituents' requests and needs. And for you to demonstrate a strong interest in this will help to get them to take this kind of action. And as Ken says, it's through our collective efforts, through TEP and coalitions and the clean industry stakeholders, that have built all this support. And we need to keep the ball rolling. So thank you for your past efforts. And it's also, as Ken said, if you're unsure of what to do, Ken is available for assistance. So don't hesitate to reach out and ask for assistance with your activities.
Yeah, here's my contact information as well as my colleague Jacob. We're both available to help. What I will say is a couple of things. One is in our sample letters, there are arguments supporting the program, and then we also include some space in the sample letter for you all to add in, how many gasoline gallons equivalent GGEs that you're reducing in your particular state or coalition territory, how many millions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions that you're helping to eliminate, so that you can, and then you can talk about a couple of local projects. So it's very effective, again, when you're submitting your requests, to make them local. I also want to mention that, some of you may, by the nature of your organization or where your coalition is housed, you may not be able to submit these requests. If that's the case, communicate with us. We can submit the requests and tell the members of the House and the Senate that we work with you. So the request is coming from us, but it still reflects the impact that the programs have on the local communities. So we can work with you on that. There are ways to get your stakeholders to submit the requests or endorse the requests. So there are a lot of ways to skin this cat, but it's very important that every Clean Cities Coalition be engaged in this process. The reason that you all got increased support contracts are because collectively we were all able to work together to increase the overall program budget for the year. And then to use that to leverage to request that DOE increase your funding. So you all have a direct interest in this, and so we we need you to continue to participate actively and aggressively if we're going to continue to be effective. There's a question, can we get a copy of the presentation? This will be up on the Transportation Energy Partners website, which is www.transportationenergypartners.org. So the answer to that is yes. Any other thoughts on appropriations, Philip?
I think you covered it pretty well. I think we ought to mention the other policy issues that we may be facing this year.
Okay, so next up are I know that one thing that everybody's very concerned about are the alternative fuel tax incentives, which everybody knows expired at the end of 2017. All of the alternative fuels industry, the National Propane Gas Association, NGV America, Electric Drive Transportation Association, National Biodiesel Board, and many other organizations, including us, have been doing a full court press to do everything possible to see that those incentives are extended. There is strong bipartisan support for the tax incentives in the Senate. In the House side, there's strong Democratic support. Republican support's a little mixed in the House, but there is Republican support. Again, folks need to hear from you. We sent up a letter signed by about 200 organizations recently asking that the incentives be extended for 5 years. So again, people need to hear about that. And the key there is, again, for the incentives to move, there needs to be some piece of legislation to attach it to. And there's currently not a lot of legislation moving. One option is there will be legislation probably sometime in the spring, unclear exactly when, but will be needed to extend the debt ceiling. So there will probably be an effort to attach the tax incentives to that legislation. So we will keep you informed about that. And again, and then there may be other tax legislation, so that's a possibility. At some point in time, there will be appropriations legislation, hopefully sooner rather than later, but that's, at the earliest, that's going to be like in the summertime or, early fall. So the timing remains a little bit uncertain. But again, just like the appropriations process, it's important that your members of the House and Senate hear from you about why the tax incentives are so important. There may be energy legislation. There may be infrastructure legislation, and with either energy or infrastructure legislation or a combined effort on both, we will be looking to see that funding for alternative fuels, infrastructure in particular, is included in that legislation. And we're also looking at including legislation that would authorize the Clean Cities program. And then finally, I know a number of you, this is impacting you, but the Department of Transportation's Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program has been a big supporter, probably the largest federal investment in alternative fuel vehicles and infrastructure over the years. And those are funds that are federal funds passed down to the states and local metropolitan planning organizations. And a number of places around the country like Ohio and New York, and California, and some in Pennsylvania, and a number of states have invested a lot of money, particularly in vehicles and some in infrastructure. However, under the current Department of Transportation, those monies have they've delayed approval of those funds for these kinds of projects due to review of the department's Buy America requirements. And over the past several years, they've approved funding for vehicles as long as the final assembly of the vehicles happened in America, and that and that was working well. However, the current administration has stopped that, and all the funding approvals are on hold while they revisit their Buy America guidance and procedures. And so we've had a couple of meetings with the Federal Highway Administration. As you can imagine, this is a highly charged political issue in this current administration. We're trying to now get some members of Congress to weigh in strategically to see if we can free up these funds, because there are a lot of important vehicle projects around the country that are being held up as a result of the current administration's approach. Let me see if we got any more questions.
While he's looking, just everybody stay tuned on those other policy issues. We may very likely will be communicating with you and seeking assistance in your involvement in those efforts that we undertake to advance those policy initiatives.
So I do not see any more questions. Again, we strongly encourage all of you all to participate actively in the appropriations process by submitting your requests to your respective members of the House and the Senate and asking them to submit them to the subcommittee. And we are available to help you submit your requests if you have any questions. So please contact us. This presentation will be on the Transportation Energy Partners website. Plus, we will send out another email blast tomorrow with a link to this presentation as well as to the sample appropriations letter. So again, we thank you for your work. We could not do this without all of you and all of your active participation. And let's continue to make sure that our voices are heard. Philip, anything else you want to add?
Thanks, everyone.
We appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.